Millionaire CEO hired a black maid for his baby, but one passionate night, he lost his heart to her. Hey everyone, I'm your storyteller, James. A very warm welcome to my channel. I'm so happy to have you here today. First of all, I want to take a moment to sincerely apologize to all of you. I know that in my last story there were a few mistakes in the editing. Some parts got repeated by mistake. Honestly, I wasn't feeling very well last night, and that's probably why those mistakes slipped through. I'm truly sorry for that, and I promise it won't happen again. Your support and love mean the world to me, and I'm so grateful for each and every one of you sticking with me. Now, let's get to today's story. It's a really special one, and trust me, the ending is absolutely charming, so you don't want to miss a second of it. Please make sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and share your thoughts in the comments. I love hearing from you all. All right, let's not wait any longer. Let's dive right into the story. Gary Kristen sat alone in his massive penthouse, overlooking the glittering skyline, the soft hum of the city beneath him barely registering in his mind. The lights stretched endlessly into the dark night, but none of it touched the emptiness that had settled deep in his chest since the day his wife died. Just a year ago, he had everything: a beautiful wife, a charming daughter, and a life most people could only dream of. But all of it had shattered in a single moment when that phone call came, the one that told him his wife's car had been crushed by a truck on a rainy night. He had rushed to the hospital, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would break his chest, only to arrive and be told that it was too late. Her body lay still and lifeless under the harsh hospital lights, her once warm hand cold in his grasp as he begged her to come back, his tears falling uselessly onto the sterile floor beneath him. That moment replayed in his mind every single night since, haunting him when he closed his eyes, and even more so when he woke up alone in the middle of the night, his hand instinctively reaching for a body that was no longer there. He was left behind, not just without a wife, but with a heartbroken daughter who barely understood what had happened. Lily was only 3 years old, and she had no way of processing why her mother suddenly disappeared, why the warmth of her mother's arms was gone forever. Gary would find her sitting by the window some nights, clutching a stuffed rabbit her mother had given her, silently staring out into the darkness with wide, lost eyes. It broke him every time. He would sit next to her, wrap his arm around her tiny frame, and tell her that everything would be okay, even though he knew it was a lie. How could everything be okay when the most important part of their lives was gone? Gary had always been strong, disciplined, and in control. He had built an empire from the ground up, turning his business into one of the most successful companies in the country. He was known for his ruthless efficiency and sharp business mind, feared and respected in the corporate world. But none of that power or money could fill the gaping hole in his chest or fix the broken look in his daughter's eyes. He tried, at first, to handle everything on his own. He cut back on work, tried to be present for Lily, but it wasn't enough. He didn't know how to reach her. His attempts at playing with her ended awkwardly. His bedtime stories were clumsy and cold compared to the warmth his wife used to provide. Lily would sit stiffly beside him, listening without smiling, and then crawl into bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit close to her chest. She hardly spoke anymore. Her laughter, a sound that used to fill their house, had vanished entirely. The staff tried to help where they could, but Lily avoided them. She didn't trust anyone anymore. She didn't want a nanny, she wanted her mother. Gary knew he couldn't give her that, but he had to do something. The weight of his failure pressed down on him every day. The cold silence of their mansion suffocated him. Every room reminded him of his wife. The scent of her perfume still lingered faintly in their bedroom. Her favorite vase sat untouched on the dining table, and Lily's drawings, the ones she used to proudly show her mother, were now abandoned in a dusty corner of the playroom. Gary couldn't breathe in that house anymore. He would sit in his office late at night, drowning himself in work, trying to escape the crushing loneliness that followed him everywhere. His assistants would come in, drop papers on his desk, and quietly leave, sensing the coldness that had settled over him. Gary barely spoke unless it was about business. His friends stopped calling. His life had turned into an endless cycle of work and empty nights, and the only thing that kept him moving was Lily. He had to be strong for her, but he didn't know how much longer he could hold himself together. One afternoon, after Lily had refused to eat her lunch and locked herself in her room, Gary sat in his study, his head in his hands. His chest tightened painfully as he listened to the quiet sobs drifting down the hallway. He couldn't keep living like this. Lily couldn't keep living like this. She needed more than a distant father and a house full of cold servants. She needed someone who could give her warmth, patience, and love. Someone who could sit beside her without feeling like a stranger. Someone who could smile at her and make her feel safe. Gary knew exactly what was missing. Lily needed a mother figure. Not to replace her real mother, that was impossible, but someone who could be a source of comfort and stability. But how could he trust anyone with something so precious? How could he bring a stranger into their home and expect them to love Lily the way she deserved? He sat there for hours, his mind turning over the same thoughts, until finally, he made a decision. He would hire someone, not just a nanny, but someone special, someone warm and patient, someone who could give Lily the care and attention she needed. He called his assistant the next morning and told her to start searching for candidates. "Find someone good," he said. "Find someone kind." His assistant nodded and left without asking questions. For the first time in months, Gary felt a small flicker of hope stir in his chest. Maybe this could work. Maybe this could help Lily heal. And maybe, just maybe, it would help him heal too. But what Gary didn't know, what he couldn't possibly predict, was that the person who would walk through his door a week later would not only change Lily's life, but his own. He didn't know that the woman he was about to hire would awaken feelings in him that he thought had died with his wife. He didn't know that his broken heart was about to beat again, all because of a woman named Anna. Anna arrived at the Kristen mansion on a quiet, chilly morning, her soft footsteps echoing down the marble hallway as the butler led her toward the grand living room. The house was stunning. Every detail screamed wealth and perfection, from the crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceiling to the plush cream-colored carpets that softened every step. But beneath the beauty, there was a coldness, a lifeless stillness that clung to the air. Anna could feel it the moment she stepped inside, the kind of emptiness that only grief could create. The butler opened the double doors to the living room, where Gary Kristen sat on a sleek black leather chair, his piercing blue eyes dark and guarded as he glanced up from the paperwork on his lap. He was even more striking in person than the photos she had seen. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a beautifully groomed beard that framed his strong jawline and perfectly tailored dark suit that clung to his muscular frame. His expression was calm, almost cold, but Anna could sense the weight beneath his gaze, the heaviness of a man carrying far too much pain. Her heart clenched at the sight of him, but she quickly focused on the small girl sitting cross-legged on the floor a few feet away. Lily. Her chest tightened at the sight of the child. Lily was beautiful, with soft brown curls and wide blue eyes, but her face was pale, her expression empty as she clutched a small stuffed rabbit to her chest. She sat silently, her gaze fixed on the floor, not even reacting when the butler announced Anna's arrival. Anna's heart swelled with sympathy. She had seen that look before, the quiet withdrawal of a child who had lost too much. Slowly, Anna knelt down on the soft carpet, keeping her movements gentle and unthreatening. "Hi there, sweetheart," Anna said softly, her voice warm and soothing. Lily's eyes shifted toward her, hesitant and wary. Anna smiled softly, her gaze full of warmth as she extended her hand. "My name's Anna. It's nice to meet you. Lily hesitated, her small fingers tightening around the stuffed rabbit. Anna didn't push. Instead, she sat back on her heels, her posture open and calm. "That's a beautiful rabbit," she said with a smile. "Does it have a name?" Lily's lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked toward Gary uncertainly. Gary's gaze was unreadable as he watched them, his sharp features tense as if he expected Lily to shrink away. But then Lily's small hand slowly stretched toward Anna's. Anna stayed perfectly still, holding her breath as Lily's tiny fingers brushed against her palm. Warmth spread through Anna's chest as Lily's hand slid into hers. "It's okay," Anna whispered. "You're safe." Lily's eyes softened, her chin trembling slightly as she gave a small, hesitant nod. Anna's smile widened as she curled her fingers gently around Lily's hand. For the first time in months, Lily allowed herself to trust. Gary's gaze darkened as he watched the exchange, something sharp stirring in his chest. He had hired Anna because of her reputation, kind, patient, experienced with children. But he hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to feel his heart clench at the sight of his daughter, willingly reaching out to someone after so many months of withdrawal. He watched as Anna scooted closer to Lily, her dark braids falling over her shoulder as she smiled down at his daughter. Anna's beauty was striking, her smooth brown skin glowing under the soft light filtering through the high windows, her large expressive eyes full of warmth and tenderness. But it wasn't just her beauty that struck Gary, it was the way her presence filled the room with quiet calm, the way her voice softened the cold edges of the house. "Do you want to sit with me?" Anna asked softly. Lily hesitated for a moment, then crawled toward her, settling into Anna's lap without a word. Anna wrapped her arms around the small girl, her touch gentle but secure. Lily leaned her head against Anna's chest, her small fingers curling into the fabric of Anna's sweater. Gary's throat tightened at the sight. It had been so long since he'd seen Lily relax in someone's arms like that. Anna ran her fingers softly through Lily's curls, humming a soft melody under her breath. Lily's eyes fluttered closed, her breathing slowing. Gary's chest squeezed painfully at the sight. He hadn't been able to comfort Lily like that. He had tried so many times, but she always remained stiff and quiet in his arms. Yet now, in Anna's arms, Lily's small frame relaxed completely, as if Anna's touch had melted the wall Lily had built around herself. "She hasn't slept that easily in months," Gary said quietly, his voice rough as he stood and crossed the room toward them. Anna's gaze lifted to his, her deep brown eyes meeting his stormy blue ones. He felt his pulse kick up as her soft, full lips curled into a gentle smile. "She's been through a lot," Anna said softly, brushing her fingers over Lily's hair. "But she's stronger than she looks." Gary's jaw tightened as he sat down on the chair across from them, his eyes never leaving Anna's face. He had hired Anna because Lily needed someone, but he hadn't expected this reaction, hadn't expected the way Anna's presence made the room feel warmer, less empty. He watched the way Anna's hands moved with such gentle precision, the way she held Lily like she had always belonged there. For the first time since his wife's death, the heaviness pressing down on his chest seemed to ease. He sat there for a long time, watching Anna cradle Lily, his heart beating painfully in his chest. He didn't want to feel this. He had closed himself off to feelings like this for a reason. But watching Anna, seeing the quiet tenderness in her eyes as she held his daughter, Gary felt the first crack in the wall he had built around his heart. Lily stirred softly against Anna's chest, her breath warm and steady. Anna smiled down at her, brushing a soft kiss against Lily's forehead. Gary's pulse quickened as he watched the gesture. His gaze shifted to Anna's face, her high cheekbones, the curve of her full lips, the delicate arch of her brows. His eyes drifted lower to the graceful line of her throat and the soft curves beneath her sweater. He clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing. He couldn't think like that. She was Lily's nanny, nothing more. But the way his heart slammed in his chest as Anna's eyes lifted to his made him realize it was already too late. His guard had started to slip the moment Anna walked into the room, and now, as he watched her cradle his daughter with such tenderness, he knew one thing for certain. Anna wasn't just healing Lily. She was waking something in him too, something dangerous and uncontrollable, and Gary wasn't sure he could stop it. Anna settled into the Kristen household as though she had always belonged there, slipping into the fabric of their lives with a quiet grace that neither Gary nor Lily had expected. From the very first day, Anna had instinctively known how to handle Lily's fragile emotions, never forcing her, never pushing too hard, but rather letting Lily come to her at her own pace. In the mornings, Anna would be up early, preparing Lily's breakfast with care, cutting her toast into little shapes and pouring just the right amount of syrup over her pancakes. Gary would often sit at the head of the long dining table, the Wall Street Journal open in his hands, but his eyes would stray toward the kitchen where Anna stood at the counter, her dark braids cascading down her back as she hummed a soft tune under her breath. Lily would sit on the counter beside her, her small legs swinging back and forth as she watched Anna work with wide, curious eyes. Anna would smile down at her, brushing her fingers through Lily's soft curls, and Gary's chest would tighten at the sight. So much tenderness, so much warmth in such a simple gesture. After breakfast, Anna would take Lily to the garden, walking barefoot in the soft grass while Lily chased butterflies and picked daisies to tuck behind Anna's ear. Gary often found himself drawn to the window overlooking the garden, unable to tear his eyes away from the sight of Anna sitting cross-legged on the ground, Lily perched in her lap as they made flower crowns together. The sound of Lily's laughter drifted through the open window, and Gary's heart ached at how much he had missed that sound. It had been too long since Lily had laughed like that, since she had trusted someone enough to let down her walls. And it wasn't just Lily who had changed. Gary had changed too. He started coming home from work earlier, finding excuses to linger in the house instead of escaping into his office. He told himself it was because of Lily, because he wanted to see his daughter happy, but deep down he knew it was because of Anna. He craved the quiet warmth she brought into the house, the way her laughter softened the hard edges of the mansion, the way her calm presence filled the empty spaces left by his wife's absence. In the evenings after dinner, Gary would sit on the edge of Lily's bed, watching as Anna sat beside her, telling her stories with such tenderness that it made his chest ache. Anna had a gift for storytelling, her voice soft and rich, full of quiet magic as she spun tales of brave princesses and fierce warriors, of enchanted forests and talking animals. Lily would hang on to every word, her small hand gripping Anna's tightly beneath the covers. And when the story ended, Lily would press her cheek against Anna's arm, her eyes fluttering closed as Anna brushed a kiss over her forehead. Gary would sit in the corner, his eyes lingering on the soft curve of Anna's lips, the delicate line of her throat as she tucked Lily beneath the blankets. His pulse quickened every time Anna's eyes lifted to meet his across the room. Soft brown eyes that seemed to see right through him, that seemed to understand the quiet storm brewing beneath his controlled exterior. He hated how much it affected him, how much he wanted to cross the room and pull her into his arms. But he knew better. He had promised himself that he wouldn't open his heart again, that he wouldn't let himself feel this way about anyone ever again. But Anna was making it difficult. She was becoming impossible to ignore. One evening, Gary stood in the doorway of Lily's room, watching as Anna told a story about a brave knight who rescued a lost princess. Lily's eyes were already drooping, her small fingers curled around Anna's hand. Gary leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest as Anna's voice filled the quiet room. "And the knight carried the princess back to her castle," Anna said softly, brushing her fingers through Lily's hair, "and promised to protect her forever." Lily's eyes closed, her breathing deep and even. Anna's gaze softened as she leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to Lily's forehead. Gary's throat tightened as Anna tucked the blankets around Lily's small frame and stood up quietly, her eyes meeting his as she moved toward the door. Gary stepped aside to let her pass, his heart slamming painfully against his ribs as her shoulder brushed his arm. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air between them, soft and sweet, like vanilla and jasmine. "She's finally sleeping through the night," Gary said quietly. Anna smiled, her brown eyes warm. "She's a strong girl," she said. "She just needed someone to remind her that she's safe." Gary's eyes darkened as he studied her face, the soft glow of the hallway light catching on the smooth brown skin of her cheeks, the delicate curve of her jaw. His gaze drifted lower to the graceful slope of her neck and the soft curves beneath her fitted sweater. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to look away. "You're good with her," he said. Anna's smile widened. "She makes it easy." Gary's chest squeezed painfully as Anna started to walk away. His hand shot out, curling gently around her wrist before he could stop himself. Anna stilled, her breath hitching as her gaze lifted to meet his. Gary's eyes darkened, his pulse quickening beneath her soft touch. "Anna," he said, his voice low and rough. Anna's lips parted, her eyes widening. Gary's grip loosened, his fingers brushing over the smooth skin of her wrist. He wanted to pull her closer, to press his mouth against hers, to feel the warmth of her body beneath his hands. But he forced himself to let go, stepping back before he could do something he would regret. Anna's breath shook as she stared at him, her cheeks flushing beneath his gaze. "Good night, Mr. Kristen," she whispered. Gary's jaw tightened as he watched her disappear down the hallway, her dark braids swaying gently behind her. He ran a hand down his face, his heart pounding violently in his chest. He had hired Anna to take care of Lily, to help his daughter heal. But now, as he stood alone in the dim hallway, his chest aching with the need to go after her, Gary realized that Anna wasn't just healing Lily. She was healing him too, and it terrified him. Gary Kristen hadn't expected it to happen. He hadn't expected to notice Anna the way he was starting to, so deeply, so intensely, that it was beginning to consume his thoughts in ways that unsettled him. At first, it was subtle. He would catch glimpses of her in passing, her braided hair shining like dark silk beneath the morning sun as she stood at the kitchen counter, preparing Lily's breakfast with practiced ease. He'd watch the way her delicate hands sliced fruit into perfect pieces, her slender fingers moving gracefully over the cutting board. When she smiled down at Lily, her brown eyes soft and full of warmth, something would twist painfully in his chest. Gary had told himself it was just gratitude, that he was thankful for the way Anna had stepped into their lives and breathed warmth into the cold emptiness that had filled the house since his wife's death. But it wasn't gratitude that made his pulse quicken every time Anna entered the room. It wasn't gratitude that made his gaze linger on the soft curve of her waist when she bent down to pick up Lily's toys, or the way her lips parted slightly when she was lost in thought. It was something deeper, something dangerous, and Gary wasn't sure he could control it anymore. One evening, Gary came home earlier than usual, drawn by some invisible force that he couldn't explain. He stood in the hallway, his heart thudding heavily in his chest as he heard the sound of laughter drifting from the living room. Slowly, he moved toward the sound, stopping at the threshold when he saw them. Anna sitting cross-legged on the plush white carpet, Lily curled up beside her as they built a tower of colorful building blocks. Anna's smile was radiant as Lily handed her another block, her small hands steady as she carefully stacked it on top of the others. "Good job, sweetheart," Anna said softly, her voice rich with praise. Lily beamed, her eyes bright with pride, as Anna leaned over and kissed the top of her head. Gary's chest tightened painfully at the sight. He had forgotten what it felt like to see Lily so happy, so full of life and trust. And it wasn't just Lily. Gary's eyes drifted to Anna, to the way her braids tumbled down her back, shimmering beneath the soft glow of the overhead light. The gentle curve of her neck was exposed where her sweater slid down her shoulder, revealing smooth, flawless brown skin that made Gary's mouth go dry. He should have walked away. He should have turned around and gone back to his office. But his feet were rooted to the spot, his gaze drawn helplessly to the way Anna's lips curved into a soft smile as she reached out and tucked a stray curl behind Lily's ear. Lily reached up, her small hand curling around Anna's wrist as her eyes fluttered closed. Gary's heart slammed violently against his ribs. He shouldn't have been thinking about her like this. Not when she was here for Lily, not when Anna was just doing her job. But damn it, it wasn't just about Lily anymore. Gary craved her presence. He found himself looking for her at odd moments during the day, his heart sinking when he couldn't find her in the kitchen or by Lily's side. He would sit in his office trying to focus on work, only to find himself distracted by the memory of her soft laughter or the way her dark eyes would brighten when Lily smiled at her. At night, when the house was quiet and Lily was fast asleep, Gary would sit in the dim light of his bedroom, his head resting against the back of the chair as images of Anna filled his mind. He would picture her standing in the kitchen, her hair pulled back into those perfect braids, her smile soft as she handed Lily a glass of milk. He would remember the way her eyes darkened with quiet concern whenever Lily had a bad dream, and the way Lily would always reach for Anna's hand before settling back into sleep. One night, Gary had walked into the living room and found Anna asleep on the couch. She had been reading a bedtime story to Lily, but Lily had fallen asleep halfway through, her small body curled against Anna's side. Anna's head had been resting against the back of the couch, her long legs tucked beneath her, and Gary had frozen at the sight. His gaze had traveled over her sleeping form, the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the soft parting of her lips, the curve of her bare shoulder where her sweater had slipped down. His throat had gone dry, his heart thudding painfully in his chest as he stood there, fighting the overwhelming urge to go to her, to kneel beside her and brush the back of his hand against her cheek. Instead, he had turned and walked away. But the feeling hadn't gone away. It only grew stronger with each passing day. He found himself sitting closer to her during dinner, their arms brushing accidentally beneath the table. He would linger in the doorway when she was putting Lily to bed, listening to the sound of her voice drifting through the hallway. He would catch her gaze across the room during quiet moments, his breath hitching when Anna's eyes lingered a second too long before she turned away. One evening, Gary stood outside the nursery, his heart racing as he listened to the sound of Anna's soft voice coming through the door. Lily had already fallen asleep, her breathing soft and steady, but Anna's voice lingered, a quiet hum of reassurance as she whispered a lullaby. Gary pushed open the door, his gaze softening as he saw Anna sitting on the edge of the bed, Lily's small hand curled around her fingers. Anna lifted her gaze when she saw him, her brown eyes widening slightly before softening. "She's asleep," Anna whispered. Gary nodded, his throat tight as he stepped toward her. Anna started to stand, but Gary's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping gently around her wrist. Anna's breath caught, her eyes widening as Gary pulled her to him, his hand brushing over the smooth skin of her arm. "You're amazing with her," Gary said softly, his gaze darkening as he looked down at her. Anna's lips parted, her eyes searching his face. "It's not hard to love her," she whispered. Gary's chest tightened painfully. "It's not hard to love you either," he murmured before he could stop himself. Anna's breath hitched, her gaze locking with his. For a moment, the air between them was charged with quiet tension, the space between them growing smaller and smaller until Gary could feel the warmth of her breath against his skin. But before he could close the distance, before he could give in to the overwhelming need burning inside him, Anna pulled back. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "Good night, Mr. Kristen," she whispered before slipping out of the room. Gary stood there for a long moment, his hands clenched at his sides, his pulse hammering violently in his chest. He had crossed a line tonight. He had let his feelings show too much, but it was too late now. The feelings stirring inside him were growing too strong to ignore, and Gary wasn't sure how much longer he could resist. Gary came home late that evening, the weight of another exhausting day dragging at his shoulders as he loosened his tie and stepped into the quiet house. The lights were dim, and the house was filled with a peaceful stillness that only came after Lily had gone to sleep. His polished shoes tapped lightly against the marble floor as he made his way toward the living room, intending to pour himself a drink before heading to bed. But when he reached the threshold, he froze. His breath hitched in his throat as his gaze landed on the couch, and on Anna. She was lying there, asleep, her head resting on a pillow, her long, stylish braids spilling over her shoulder like rivers of silk. Her brown skin glowed under the soft light of the room, and her face, so calm and relaxed in sleep, made something inside Gary tighten painfully. His feet moved toward her without his permission, his eyes drinking in the sight of her slender form curled up on the couch, her long legs tucked beneath a light blanket. She looked so soft, so vulnerable, that his chest ached. He didn't know how long he stood there, watching her sleep. The steady rise and fall of her chest, making his heartbeat quicken unnaturally. His gaze drifted over her peaceful face, the delicate arch of her eyebrows, the soft fullness of her lips, and the long, dark lashes resting against her cheeks. She was beautiful, stunning, really. But it wasn't just her beauty that drew him in. It was the quiet strength she carried, the calm grace with which she handled everything in his chaotic life. The way she had filled the emptiness left behind by his wife's death without even realizing it. The way Lily had begun to laugh again, to trust again, because of her. Gary's throat tightened as he crouched down beside the couch, resting one arm against the cushion as his other hand hesitantly reached out. His fingers hovered above her face for a moment, his heart pounding in his ears. And then, almost without realizing it, he brushed a loose strand of her braids away from her cheek, his fingertips grazing the smooth warmth of her skin. Anna's lips parted slightly in her sleep, and Gary's breath caught. His hand lingered against her cheek, his thumb brushing softly along her jawline as his gaze darkened with quiet longing. God, she was perfect. His eyes drifted to her mouth, the soft curve of her bottom lip, and something primal twisted low in his stomach. His gaze sharpened, the tension coiling inside him like a tight spring. His thumb traced the outline of her lips before he pulled back, clenching his hand into a fist as a quiet groan slid through his throat. He should stop. He should get up and walk away. But his body refused to listen. His gaze lingered on her lips, his chest tightening painfully as the need growing inside him intensified. Slowly, carefully, he leaned forward, his breath hitching as he closed the small distance between them. His lips brushed softly against her forehead, the warmth of her skin igniting something dangerous inside him. He stayed there for a moment, his mouth resting against her skin, his heart slamming violently in his chest. Her scent surrounded him, soft and feminine with a hint of vanilla and honey, and it made his pulse hammer dangerously. He pulled back just slightly, his face hovering inches above hers as his gaze drifted down to her lips again. His control slipped another inch. His mouth brushed the corner of her lips, the softness of her skin making his entire body tighten with restrained hunger. He hadn't meant for it to happen, hadn't meant to lose control like this, but the pull toward her was too strong, too consuming. His hand slid to the back of her neck, his fingers threading through the soft braids as he lowered his mouth closer to hers. Just as his lips were about to touch hers, Anna stirred. Her long lashes fluttered open, and her brown eyes widened in sleepy confusion as she realized how close he was. "Mr. Kristen," Her voice was soft and breathless, her gaze searching his face as her hands instinctively pressed against his chest. Gary froze, his hands still resting against her neck as he watched the confusion in her eyes slowly shift into something deeper, something dangerous. Her breath hitched as Gary's gaze dropped to her mouth, and the soft sound of her breathless inhale made his pulse skyrocket. His thumbs stroked the delicate skin beneath her jaw, and Anna's lips parted slightly beneath his touch. He wanted to kiss her. God, he wanted to taste her. His control was hanging by a thread, and the way her eyes darkened as they locked with his made it impossible for him to think clearly. Anna. His voice was low and rough, his mouth hovering just inches from hers. Anna's breath hitched. What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice shaky and uncertain. Gary swallowed hard, his hand tightening slightly on the back of her neck. "I don't know," he admitted hoarsely. "But I can't stop." Anna's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock. But she didn't pull away. Her hands curled against his chest, her fingers brushing against the fabric of his dress shirt as her gaze remained locked with his. Gary's restraint cracked. His mouth brushed against hers, a feather-light caress that left them both breathless. Anna gasped, her eyes fluttering closed for a brief moment before she opened them again, her gaze dark with confusion and something else. Something dangerous. "Mr. Kristen," she whispered again, her voice trembling. Gary's gaze softened, his thumb brushing over her cheek as his other hand slid to her waist. "Gary," he corrected softly. "Call me Gary." Anna's lips trembled as her gaze remained locked with his. Gary's heart hammered violently in his chest as his mouth hovered inches from hers, their breath mingling in the quiet space between them. But just as he was about to give in to the overwhelming need burning inside him, Anna pulled back slightly, her cheeks flushed with heat. "I should go to bed," she whispered, her voice shaky. Gary's hand lingered against her waist for a moment before he finally released her. Anna stood slowly, her gaze still clouded with confusion, as she took a small step back. "Good night, Mr. Gary," she corrected, her cheeks burning as she turned and hurried toward the hallway. Gary sat there for a long moment after she left, his chest rising and falling with the weight of his ragged breathing. His hand curled into a fist against the cushion where Anna had been lying, his jaw tightening as the taste of her soft breath lingered against his lips. He had crossed a line tonight, and he knew it. But the way Anna had looked at him, the soft parting of her lips, the wide darkness of her eyes, told him she had felt it too. The pull between them was undeniable now, and Gary wasn't sure if he had the strength to fight it anymore. Anna stirred as the soft warmth of morning light filtered through the curtains, her long lashes fluttering against her cheeks as she slowly opened her eyes. Her breath hitched when she realized how close Gary was, his face only inches from hers, his intense blue eyes watching her with an emotion so raw it sent a shiver down her spine. Her heart thudded painfully as she lay there frozen beneath his gaze, the silence between them thick with unspoken tension. She tried to sit up, her lips parting to say something, but before a single word could escape, Gary's hand slid gently along her cheek, his fingertips brushing against her smooth brown skin. "Anna," he whispered, his voice low and rough, filled with an aching vulnerability that made her chest tighten. Her eyes widened as his gaze dropped to her lips, and before she could think, before she could breathe, his mouth descended on hers in a feather-light caress. A soft gasp slipped from her lips, her wide eyes meeting his. But Gary didn't stop. His hand cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking the delicate curve of her cheek as his mouth moved slowly, tenderly against hers. The softness of his lips sent a jolt of heat down her spine, and Anna's breath hitched painfully as the kiss deepened. His other hand slid around the back of her neck, pulling her closer, and this time she didn't pull away. Her heart was hammering so loudly in her chest that she could barely hear the quiet sound of their mingled breaths. Gary's lips coaxed hers open, his tongue brushing softly against her bottom lip, and Anna trembled as his warmth surrounded her completely. His scent, clean and masculine with a hint of cedar and spice, filled her senses, making her dizzy as his mouth claimed hers with quiet desperation. Her hands curled against his chest, her fingers tangling in the soft fabric of his dress shirt as Gary's lips pressed harder against hers. A quiet moan escaped her throat as he deepened the kiss, his arm tightening around her waist as he pulled her against him. Anna's body melted into his as her trembling hands slid up the front of his shirt, her fingers brushing against the warm skin beneath the thin fabric. Gary's breath caught, his hand sliding down to her hip as his mouth slanted over hers with growing hunger. He kissed her as if he were starving, as if he'd been holding back for too long and couldn't fight it anymore. Anna's breath hitched as her body pressed flush against his, the heat of his chest burning through the thin barrier of her nightgown. Her lips parted beneath his, and Gary groaned low in his throat as his hand slid to the small of her back, pulling her even closer. Anna gasped softly against his mouth, her heart racing wildly as his lips left hers and trailed along the side of her neck. "Gary," she breathed, her hands trembling as she threaded her fingers through his dark hair. His mouth lingered against the soft skin beneath her ear, his breath hot and unsteady as his lips brushed against her pulse. "Anna," he murmured, his voice dark and strained. Her eyes fluttered closed as his hands gripped her waist, his thumb stroking the delicate curve of her hip through the thin fabric of her nightgown. "I can't. Stop," Gary whispered hoarsely, his lips finding hers again in a kiss so deep and consuming that Anna's knees nearly buckled beneath her. Her hands slid down to his chest, feeling the rapid thud of his heartbeat beneath her fingertips as his mouth claimed hers with undeniable possession. Anna's breath hitched as Gary's hand slid down to her thigh, his fingers brushing against her bare skin beneath the hem of her nightgown. A soft whimper escaped her lips as his mouth trailed down her throat, his breath hitching as his hand gripped her waist more firmly. But then, as if realizing how close he was to losing control, Gary pulled back slightly, his breathing ragged as his forehead rested against hers. Anna's eyes fluttered open, her cheeks flushed, her lips swollen from his kiss as her gaze met his. "Mr. Kristen," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Gary's eyes darkened, his thumb brushing across her cheek as his gaze burned into hers. "Gary?" he corrected softly, his voice rough and low. Anna swallowed hard, her chest rising and falling with each uneven breath as Gary's fingers slid beneath her chin, tilting her face upward. "Say my name," he murmured. "Please." Anna's lips trembled as her wide brown eyes locked with his. "Gary," she whispered. A quiet groan slid from his throat, and then his mouth was on hers again, harder this time, more desperate. His hands slid to the small of her back, lifting her onto his lap as his mouth claimed hers with a quiet ferocity that stole the breath from her lungs. Anna's arms wrapped around his neck as Gary's hand slid beneath her nightgown, his fingers brushing against the bare skin of her back. Her pulse hammered violently as his lips left hers and trailed down the side of her throat, his teeth grazing the delicate skin beneath her ear. "Gary," Anna gasped, her hands fisting in his hair as his mouth pressed a soft kiss to the hollow of her throat. He lifted his head, his blue eyes burning with quiet hunger as his thumb brushed across her bottom lip. "I've wanted this," he confessed softly, his gaze dark with vulnerability. "I've wanted you for so long, Anna. I can't fight it anymore." Anna's breath hitched as her hand slid to the side of his face, her thumb brushing against the sharp edge of his jaw. "Then don't," she whispered. Gary's eyes darkened, and then his mouth was on hers again, his kiss slow and deep, his hands tangling in her hair as he pulled her closer. Anna's heart pounded as Gary's hand slid beneath the hem of her nightgown, his fingers brushing against the smooth skin of her thigh. Her breath hitched as Gary's lips left hers and pressed a lingering kiss to the side of her neck. "Anna," he breathed. Her hands slid down his chest, her fingers brushing against the hard lines of his muscles beneath the thin fabric of his shirt. Gary's eyes softened as his hand slid to the side of her face, his thumb brushing across her cheek. "You have no idea how much you mean to me," he whispered. Anna's lips parted as Gary's forehead rested against hers, his eyes burning with quiet vulnerability as his hands cupped her face. "You make me feel alive again," he admitted softly. Anna's throat tightened, her chest aching as Gary's mouth brushed against hers one last time, a slow, lingering kiss filled with quiet desperation and longing. When he finally pulled away, their gazes remained locked, their breaths mingling in the quiet stillness between them. Gary's hand lingered against her face for a moment before he pulled back slightly, his gaze dark with quiet need. Anna's heart hammered painfully as Gary's thumb brushed across her bottom lip one last time. And then, without another word, Gary stood slowly, his hand sliding down her arm before he finally let go and walked away, leaving Anna breathless and trembling in the quiet stillness of the room. Gary's breath hitched as he gazed down at Anna, his heart hammering wildly against his ribcage as he cradled her delicate frame in his arms. The soft weight of her body against his chest made his pulse quicken, and when her wide, vulnerable brown eyes met his, he knew there was no going back. His fingers brushed tenderly across her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw as he carried her upstairs, each step echoing through the quiet stillness of the mansion. His breath was shallow, his muscles taut with unspoken tension, as he pushed open the bedroom door with his foot and stepped inside. The moonlight filtering through the curtains cast a soft silver glow across the room, illuminating Anna's smooth brown skin and the delicate rise and fall of her chest as he lowered her onto the bed. Gary's heart tightened painfully at the sight of her lying beneath him, her long braids spilling across the pillows like dark silk. "Anna," he whispered, his voice low and strained as he sat beside her, his hand brushing down the side of her face. She trembled beneath his touch, her breath quickening as his thumb traced the soft curve of her bottom lip. Her lips parted, a quiet gasp slipping from her throat as Gary's hand slid down the side of her neck, his fingers curling around the delicate line of her collarbone. His gaze darkened as he leaned over her, his lips hovering inches from hers. "Do you want this?" he whispered, his breath warm against her mouth. Anna's chest rose and fell beneath the thin fabric of her nightgown, her heart racing so loudly that it drowned out every other sound. Her trembling hand slid to the side of his face, her fingertips brushing against the hard line of his jaw as her wide eyes softened. "Yes," she breathed. A quiet groan slipped from Gary's throat as his lips descended on hers, slow and gentle at first, his mouth coaxing hers open with aching tenderness. Anna's arms slid around his neck as he deepened the kiss, his tongue brushing softly against hers as his hand slipped beneath the hem of her nightgown, his fingertips gliding over the smooth skin of her thigh. Anna gasped as Gary's mouth trailed down the side of her neck, his breath hitching as his hand slid higher, his thumb brushing over the soft swell of her hip. His other hand tangled in her braids as he kissed the delicate line of her throat, his mouth trailing down to the hollow beneath her collarbone. Anna's back arched beneath him, her breath quick and shallow as Gary's hand slid beneath the thin fabric of her gown, his fingertips brushing against the bare skin of her waist. His lips claimed hers again, harder this time, filled with quiet desperation as his hand slid down to her thigh and hooked her leg around his waist. Anna's breath caught as Gary's hand slid up her back, his lips pressing heated kisses down the side of her neck. "Anna," he groaned, his voice rough and strained. Her hands slid beneath his shirt, her fingers brushing against the hard planes of his stomach, as Gary's mouth descended on hers again, his kiss growing more urgent. His hands slid beneath her gown, pushing the fabric up over her hips as his mouth found the soft curve of her shoulder. Anna gasped as his hand slid higher, his thumb brushing over the sensitive skin beneath her ribcage. "Gary," she breathed, her voice trembling. His eyes darkened as his hand slid higher, his fingers tracing the delicate curve of her waist. "Tell me you want this," he murmured, his lips brushing against her ear. "I want you," Anna whispered, her hands sliding up his chest as her wide brown eyes met his. A quiet groan slid from Gary's throat as his mouth claimed hers again, his hands gripping her hips as he pulled her beneath him. Anna's breath hitched as Gary's lips trailed down her neck, his mouth finding the sensitive curve of her shoulder as his hand slid beneath the thin strap of her nightgown. Her back arched as his mouth moved lower, his breath hitching as his hands slid over her hips and pushed the gown higher. Anna's hands tangled in his hair as Gary's lips found hers again, his kiss deep and consuming as his hands slid over the bare skin of her back. "Anna," he breathed, his voice raw with need. "I can't. Stop." Anna's breath caught as Gary's hand slid down her thigh, his fingers pressing into her skin as his mouth moved over hers with quiet desperation. "Then don't," she whispered. Gary's gaze darkened as his lips claimed hers again, his kiss slow and deep as his hands slid beneath the thin fabric of her gown. Anna gasped as Gary's mouth trailed down the side of her neck, his breath hot and ragged as his hand slid down to her hip. Her fingers tangled in his hair as his mouth claimed hers again, his kiss rough and desperate as his hands gripped her hips. "Anna," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers as his breath came hard and fast. "You make me lose control." Anna's breath hitched as her hands slid down his chest, her fingers brushing against the hard lines of his stomach. "Then lose control," she whispered, her eyes soft and vulnerable as her lips parted beneath his. A quiet groan slid from Gary's throat as his mouth claimed hers again, his hands sliding beneath the thin fabric of her gown as his lips trailed down the side of her neck. Anna gasped as Gary's hand slid down her thigh, his fingers brushing against her bare skin as his mouth moved over hers with growing hunger. Her hands curled against his back as Gary's mouth trailed lower, his breath hitching as his hands slid beneath the thin straps of her gown. "Anna," he breathed, his voice rough and strained. "You're so beautiful." Anna's breath hitched as Gary's hands slid higher, his mouth trailing over the soft skin of her shoulder as his gaze darkened with quiet need. "I need you," he whispered, his mouth brushing against her ear. "Please." Anna's heart pounded wildly as her arms slid around his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair as his mouth claimed hers again, his kiss deep and consuming. Gary's hands slid over her hips as his mouth found hers again, his breath coming hard and fast as his hands slid beneath the thin fabric of her gown. Anna's breath caught as Gary's lips trailed down the side of her neck, his breath hot and ragged as his hands gripped her hips. "Gary," she gasped, her hands curling against his back. His gaze darkened as his mouth claimed hers again, his kiss rough and desperate as his hands slid over her hips. "I can't. Stop," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers as his breath came hard and fast. "Then don't," Anna whispered, her eyes soft and vulnerable as her lips parted beneath his. Gary's mouth claimed hers again, his hands sliding beneath the thin fabric of her gown as his lips trailed down the side of her neck. When dawn broke, Anna lay wrapped in his arms, her head resting on his chest as Gary's hand slid over her back. His lips brushed against her hair as his arms tightened around her. "I'm not letting you go," he whispered, his voice low and strained. "Never." Anna's breath hitched as Gary's hand slid beneath the thin fabric of her gown, his fingers brushing against her bare skin as his mouth found hers again in a soft, lingering kiss. "You're mine, Anna," he whispered. "Forever." Anna's heart pounded wildly as Gary's mouth claimed hers again, his hands gripping her hips as his breath came hard and fast. "Forever," Anna whispered, her eyes soft and vulnerable as her lips parted beneath his. The soft glow of dawn filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a golden hue over the room as Gary's eyes fluttered open. His arm was draped protectively over Anna's waist, her delicate frame nestled perfectly against his chest. For a moment, he simply lay there, watching her sleep, his heart swelling with a warmth he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. Anna's dark lashes fluttered against her cheeks as she stirred, her lips parting slightly as she took a soft breath. Gary's heart tightened at the sight of her face, so close to his, serene, beautiful, vulnerable. Slowly, his hand brushed through the cascade of her long braids, his fingers trailing down to tuck a loose strand behind her ear. Anna's eyes fluttered open, her deep brown gaze meeting his with quiet surprise. Gary's breath caught as he smiled softly, his thumb brushing over the soft curve of her cheek. "You're so beautiful," he whispered, his voice low and rough from sleep. Anna's cheeks flushed, her lips curving into a soft smile as her gaze dropped shyly. Gary's hand slid down her arm, his fingers curling around her waist as he pulled her closer until their bodies were pressed together beneath the thin sheet. "The way you've cared for Lily," he murmured, his eyes dark with quiet intensity as his hand slid to the small of her back. "The way you've healed her. You've healed me too." Anna's heart raced wildly as Gary's hand slid lower, his fingertips tracing the curve of her spine through the thin fabric of the bedsheet. Her breath quickened as his other hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing across her lower lip. "Gary," she whispered, her gaze soft and vulnerable as she reached up to touch his face. Gary's eyes darkened as her fingers slid over the hard lines of his jaw, his breath hitching as her touch sent a jolt of warmth through his chest. "I don't want this to be a mistake," he said, his voice low and raw as his forehead rested against hers. "I want more nights with you, Anna. I want every night with you." Anna's breath hitched as his hand slid beneath the sheet, his fingers tracing the curve of her hip with aching tenderness. Her heart pounded wildly as his lips brushed over hers, soft and lingering. Gary's breath was hot against her mouth as his hand slid to the nape of her neck, his fingers tangling in the roots of her braids as his mouth hovered inches from hers. Anna's eyes softened as her hand slid down his chest, her fingertips brushing over his racing heartbeat. "Gary," she whispered, her voice trembling as his lips brushed against the corner of her mouth. I don't know how to do this." Gary's hand slid over her back as he pulled her against him, his breath hitching as his lips brushed over her cheek. "You don't have to know how," he whispered. "Just let me love you." Anna's eyes widened, her breath catching as Gary's lips captured hers in a soft, lingering kiss. Her arms slid around his neck as he deepened the kiss, his hand sliding up her back beneath the sheet. Anna's heart pounded wildly as Gary's mouth moved over hers with quiet desperation, his breath hot and ragged as his hand slid down her side, tracing the delicate curve of her waist. His kiss was slow and tender, yet beneath it was a quiet hunger that made Anna's skin burn beneath his touch. Her breath quickened as Gary's lips trailed down her neck, his mouth pressing heated kisses against her bare shoulder. "I want you," he murmured against her skin, his voice low and strained. Anna's cheeks flushed as her hands slid down his back, her fingers curling against the hard muscles beneath his skin. Gary's hand slid beneath her chin, tilting her face upward as his gaze met hers. "Do you feel it too?" he asked, his voice rough with quiet longing. Anna's heart thudded painfully in her chest as her wide brown eyes met his. Slowly she nodded, her lips parting as Gary's hand slid to the back of her neck. "Yes," she whispered. Gary's gaze darkened as his mouth claimed hers again, his kiss growing deeper and more desperate as his hand slid over her hip. "Anna," he groaned, his forehead resting against hers as his breath came hard and fast. "I don't know how to stop wanting you." Anna's hands slid over his chest as her breath came shallow and quick. "Then don't stop," she whispered, her eyes soft and vulnerable as her lips parted beneath his. A low groan slid from Gary's throat as his mouth claimed hers again, his hands gripping her waist as he rolled her beneath him. Anna's breath hitched as Gary's lips trailed down her neck, his breath hot and ragged against her skin. Her arms wrapped around his shoulders as his mouth trailed lower, his hands sliding beneath the sheet as his lips found the soft curve of her shoulder. "You're mine," he whispered, his voice rough with quiet possession as his hands slid over her back. Anna's heart raced wildly as her hands tangled in his hair, her breath catching as Gary's mouth found hers again, his kiss deep and consuming. "I've never felt this way before," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers as his breath came hard and fast. Anna's eyes softened as her hand slid down the side of his face, her thumb brushing over the hard line of his jaw. "Me either," she whispered. Gary's gaze darkened as his hand slid beneath her chin, tilting her face upward. "Stay with me," he murmured, his breath warm against her mouth. "I don't want this to end." Anna's breath hitched as his hand slid down her side, his fingers tracing the soft curve of her hip. "I'm scared," she whispered. Gary's lips brushed over her forehead as his hand curled around her waist. "I'll protect you," he murmured. "I won't hurt you." I swear Anna's eyes filled with quiet vulnerability as her arms wrapped around his shoulders. "Promise?" she whispered. Gary's gaze softened as his hand slid over her back, his fingers curling around the nape of her neck. "I promise," he whispered, his mouth brushing over hers in a soft, lingering kiss. Anna's breath quickened as Gary's hand slid beneath the sheet, his fingers tracing the soft curve of her back. Her heart thudded painfully as his lips moved over hers, his kiss deep and consuming as his hands slid over her waist. "You're mine," he whispered against her mouth, "and I'm not letting you go." Anna's eyes softened as her hand slid down his chest, her fingertips brushing over his racing heartbeat. "I don't want you to," she whispered. Gary's mouth claimed hers again, his kiss slow and lingering as his hands slid over her back. When he pulled away, his gaze darkened as his hand slid over her hip. "Say it," he whispered, his voice low and rough. "Say you want this too." Anna's breath hitched as her gaze met his. "I want this," she whispered. Gary's hand slid over her back as his mouth claimed hers again. "Good," he murmured, "because I'm not letting you go." Anna's heart raced wildly as her arms wrapped around his shoulders, her breath quickening as his mouth moved over hers with growing desperation. Her heart pounded painfully as Gary's hand slid over her back, his fingers curling against her skin as his mouth claimed hers in a soft, lingering kiss. "You're mine," he whispered. "Forever." Anna's breath caught as her gaze softened. "Forever," she whispered. The sun streamed softly through the large windows of the nursery, casting golden light over the delicate white lace curtains and the soft pastel tones of the room. Anna sat on the rocking chair near the window, her arms wrapped securely around Lily's small frame as the little girl rested her head against Anna's chest. The room was quiet except for the gentle hum of Anna's soft voice as she read a bedtime story, her hand stroking Lily's silky blonde curls as the little girl clung to her dress with one hand, her other hand tucked beneath her chin. Lily's eyes were half-lidded, her long lashes fluttering against her flushed cheeks as Anna's soothing voice filled the air, weaving a calm, protective cocoon around them. Gary stood silently in the doorway, his tall frame leaning against the edge of the doorframe, his piercing gaze softened as he watched the scene unfold before him. His heart ached at the sight. Anna, so beautiful and tender, holding his daughter with such natural ease, her expression filled with so much quiet love that it made his breath hitch painfully in his throat. Lily stirred slightly in Anna's arms, her tiny fingers reaching up to trace the line of Anna's jaw. "Mama?" The little girl's soft, sleepy voice broke the quiet stillness of the room. Time seemed to freeze in that instant. Anna's breath hitched as her wide eyes blinked in stunned disbelief, her heart slamming against her chest as Lily's innocent word echoed through the room like a soft but powerful tremor. Gary's chest tightened painfully as his gaze sharpened, his breath catching hard in his throat as his hands curled into fists at his sides. Anna's lips parted as her hand slid up to cup Lily's small hand against her cheek, her eyes swimming with sudden tears as her chest rose and fell in a shaky breath. "Yes, baby," Anna whispered, her voice trembling with overwhelming emotion as she pressed a soft kiss to Lily's forehead. Lily's little arms curled around Anna's neck as the child buried her face against Anna's chest, her breath soft and warm against Anna's skin. Gary's heart clenched violently as he watched Anna close her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks as she held Lily even closer, her hand running soothingly down the little girl's back. A lump formed in Gary's throat as he took a cautious step into the room, his footsteps light against the polished hardwood floor. Anna's gaze lifted toward him, her eyes wide and shimmering with tears as their gazes locked across the room. Gary's chest constricted painfully as he saw the raw emotion in her gaze, vulnerability, fear, and yet profound joy. His heart pounded hard against his ribs as Lily's small hand fisted in Anna's dress, the little girl's breathing soft and steady as she drifted between sleep and wakefulness in Anna's comforting embrace. Gary's hands curled at his sides as his gaze softened, his eyes burning with an emotion he could no longer deny. Slowly, he crossed the room, his footsteps deliberate as he moved toward the rocking chair. Anna's eyes followed him, her breath trembling as Gary lowered himself to his knees beside them, his gaze never leaving her face. His large hand brushed over Lily's golden curls, his fingers lingering tenderly as the little girl sighed in her sleep, her lips parting slightly as her cheek rested against Anna's shoulder. Gary's gaze lifted, his dark eyes locking with Anna's tearful gaze. His throat tightened painfully as his hand slid over Anna's, his fingers curling gently around hers. "She called you, Mama," Gary whispered, his voice rough and low as his thumb brushed over the back of her hand. Anna's breath hitched as a fresh tear slipped down her cheek, her hand tightening around his as her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. I don't know why," she whispered, her voice trembling as her gaze searched his desperately. Gary's eyes softened as his free hand slid up to cup her face, his thumb brushing tenderly over her tear-streaked cheek. "Because you've been a mother to her," he murmured, his voice low and reverent as his gaze darkened with quiet intensity. "Because you've loved her, more than anyone else ever has." Anna's lower lip trembled as Gary's hand slid to the back of her neck, his fingers threading through the base of her braids as his gaze darkened. "Anna," he whispered, his breath brushing over her lips as his forehead rested against hers. "You've changed everything." Anna's breath hitched as Gary's hand slid over her shoulder, his fingers tracing the delicate curve of her collarbone. "She loves you," he murmured. "And so do I." Anna's breath trembled as her eyes widened, her chest tightening painfully as Gary's hand slid down her arm. "Gary," she whispered, her voice shaky as her gaze searched his desperately. Gary's thumb brushed over her lips, his gaze dark and soft with quiet vulnerability. "I love you," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've loved you since the moment you walked into this house." Anna's chest constricted as Gary's lips brushed over her forehead, his breath warm and ragged as his hand tightened around hers. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Stay with us." Anna's heart raced wildly as her gaze softened, her arms curling protectively around Lily as the little girl stirred softly against her chest. "You mean it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Gary's gaze darkened as his hand slid to the back of her neck, his fingers threading through her hair as his lips brushed over hers in a soft, lingering kiss. "I mean it," he murmured against her mouth. "I want you. I want you with us. Forever." Anna's breath shuddered as a tear slipped down her cheek, her heart breaking open as Gary's lips claimed hers in a deep, tender kiss. Lily sighed softly between them, her small hand curling over Anna's shoulder as Gary's hand slid protectively over the child's back. Anna's breath caught as Gary pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers as his hand tightened over hers. "She called you Mama," he whispered again, his voice rough with quiet wonder. Anna's eyes shimmered with tears as her gaze softened, her hand sliding over Gary's chest as her breath hitched painfully. "I love her," Anna whispered, her lips parting beneath his as her voice trembled. Gary's mouth curled into a soft, reverent smile as his hand slid over the back of her neck, his lips brushing over her forehead. "And she loves you," he whispered. Anna's chest tightened as Lily's small hand reached up to touch her cheek, the little girl's soft breath warming her skin as her eyelids fluttered sleepily. Gary's gaze softened as his arm slid around Anna's waist, his hand resting over the small of her back as his forehead pressed against hers. "We love you," he whispered. Anna's heart swelled painfully as Gary's hand slid over Lily's back, his gaze dark and tender as his mouth brushed over hers once more. "You belong with us," he whispered. "Forever." Anna's breath trembled as she nodded, her eyes shimmering with quiet acceptance as her hand slid over Gary's chest. "Forever," she whispered. Gary's eyes darkened as his hand slid beneath her chin, his lips brushing over hers in a soft, lingering kiss. "Forever," he repeated, his voice low and steady as his hand slid over Lily's back. "You're ours now." Anna's breath hitched as Lily's small hand curled around her finger, the little girl's soft sigh echoing between them as Gary's lips claimed hers once more. And as Anna melted into his embrace, her heart finally found the home it had been searching for all along. That night, the house was cloaked in soft silence, the only sound the quiet hum of the night air filtering through the slightly open window. The moonlight spilled across the room, casting soft silver beams over the king-sized bed where Gary lay, his arm wrapped tightly around Anna's waist as she nestled against his chest. Her breath was soft and steady, her slender fingers resting lightly against the warm skin of his chest, her cheek pressed against his heart. Gary's dark eyes flickered open, his gaze dropping to her face, the soft glow of the moon highlighting the delicate curve of her cheek and the gentle flutter of her eyelashes as she rested against him. His heart tightened painfully as he replayed the moment from earlier, the way Lily had reached up with her tiny hand, the fragile, trembling sound of her voice as she called Anna Mama. The word had shot straight through Gary's heart, unraveling him from the inside out. He had stood there, frozen, his breath trapped painfully in his lungs as he watched Anna cradle Lily with so much tenderness, so much quiet love, that it left him breathless. Even now, the echo of Lily's innocent voice was branded into his soul, and the sight of Anna's tear-filled eyes as she whispered, "Yes, baby," was seared into his mind. Gary's chest rose and fell in a shaky breath as his hand slid down the length of Anna's back, his fingertips brushing over the soft fabric of her nightgown as his gaze darkened. He tightened his hold on her, his jaw flexing as his hand slid into her long braids, his fingers threading through the silky strands as his breath ghosted over the top of her head. Anna stirred softly against him, her breath hitching as her slender hand curled over his chest. Slowly, her lashes fluttered open, her soft brown eyes meeting his in the dim light. A soft smile touched her lips as her gaze softened. "Gary," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. Gary's heart hammered hard against his ribcage as his hand slid down to her waist, pulling her even closer until her soft curves molded perfectly against him. "Did you hear her?" he whispered, his voice rough with quiet intensity. Anna's breath caught as her eyes widened, her hand trembling slightly against his chest. Gary's gaze darkened as his fingers brushed down the side of her face, his thumb tracing the delicate curve of her cheekbone. "She called you Mama," he whispered again, his breath ragged as his forehead pressed against hers. Anna's breath shuddered as her eyes filled with quiet emotion, her lips parting slightly as Gary's thumb brushed over the corner of her mouth. "She needs love," Anna whispered, her voice trembling as her hand slid over his chest. "And so do you." Gary's chest tightened painfully as her words washed over him, his breath catching hard in his throat. His hand slid beneath her jaw, his fingers curling around the delicate nape of her neck as his gaze darkened with quiet vulnerability. "Anna," he whispered, his voice rough with raw need. "You've given her everything she's ever needed, but what about me?" Anna's breath trembled as Gary's hand slid down to her waist, his fingers pressing into the soft curve of her hip as his forehead pressed against hers. "I need you," he breathed, his voice thick with quiet desperation. Anna's heart slammed violently against her chest as Gary's hand slid beneath her chin, tilting her face toward him until their lips were mere inches apart. "I don't just want you for one night," he whispered, his voice a low, trembling rasp. "I want you forever." Anna's breath hitched as his lips brushed over hers, the soft warmth of his mouth stealing the air from her lungs. Her hands curled into the fabric of his shirt as his breath mingled with hers, his mouth lingering over hers in a soft, reverent kiss that sent heat spiraling through her veins. "Forever," she whispered, her voice breaking as Gary's hand slid down her back, pulling her even closer. Gary's gaze darkened as his hand threaded through her braids, his thumb brushing over her lower lip as his mouth curled into a soft smile. "Forever," he repeated, his voice low and steady. "I want you with me. I want you with Lily. I want to wake up every morning with you beside me." Anna's breath trembled as Gary's lips brushed over her jawline, his hand sliding over the curve of her waist as her heart raced wildly in her chest. "Gary," she whispered, her voice breaking as his mouth trailed down the side of her neck, his breath hot and ragged against her skin. "Do you really mean it?" Gary's dark eyes lifted toward her, his gaze burning with quiet intensity. "I've never meant anything more in my life," he whispered, his hand tightening over her waist as his lips hovered over hers. "You've changed everything, Anna. You've healed Lily, and you've healed me." Anna's heart swelled painfully as Gary's hand slid into her hair, his fingers threading through the silky strands as his mouth claimed hers in a deep, lingering kiss. Her arms wrapped around his neck as his mouth moved hungrily over hers, his hand sliding down the small of her back as he pulled her against him. Her breath shuddered as Gary's mouth trailed down the side of her neck, his hand sliding beneath the hem of her nightgown as her heart hammered wildly in her chest. "I need you," Gary whispered, his voice rough with quiet desperation as his lips brushed over her ear. "Not just tonight, not just tomorrow. I need you for the rest of my life." Anna's breath trembled as her hands slid over his chest, her lips parting beneath his as his mouth captured hers again in a deep, soul-stealing kiss. Gary's hand slid beneath her jaw, his thumb brushing over the curve of her chin as his forehead pressed against hers. "Say yes," he whispered, his voice dark and reverent. "Tell me you'll stay." Anna's eyes shimmered with quiet tears as her hand slid over his cheek, her heart swelling painfully as Gary's mouth brushed over hers once more. "Yes," she whispered, her breath breaking against his lips. "Yes, Gary, I'm yours." Gary's chest rose and fell in a shaky breath as his hand slid into her hair, his mouth claiming hers in a fierce, passionate kiss that left her breathless. His hand slid down the curve of her back as he pulled her against him, his body molding to hers as his breath mingled with hers. "Forever," he whispered against her lips. Anna's heart hammered painfully in her chest as her fingers curled into his shirt, her breath trembling as her mouth parted beneath his. "Forever," she whispered. Gary's breath broke as his mouth claimed hers again, his hands sliding down her back as he pulled her beneath him, his heart hammering violently against his chest as Anna's arms wrapped around his neck. And as Gary's mouth captured hers once more, his hand sliding over her waist as her breath trembled beneath him, he knew, deep in his soul, that he would never let her go. The night was painted in shades of deep blue and silver. The sky stretched endlessly above the rooftop, where the city lights sparkled like fallen stars beneath them. The air was crisp but not cold, the soft hum of distant traffic blending with the gentle whisper of the night breeze. Anna stood at the edge of the rooftop, her breath catching as she looked at the breathtaking setup before her. A pathway of white rose petals stretched from the door to a small table draped in white silk, lit by the soft flicker of candlelight. Twinkling fairy lights were woven through the wrought iron railing, casting a soft golden glow over the scene. Small lanterns hung from above, swaying gently with the breeze, creating a magical, dreamlike atmosphere. Anna's heart fluttered wildly as Gary appeared at her side, his dark suit tailored perfectly to his lean frame, his piercing gaze soft with an intensity that made her breathless. He reached for her hand, his fingers threading through hers as he led her toward the table. Anna's white dress billowed softly around her legs, the silky fabric brushing against her skin as Gary pulled out her chair, his hand brushing against her bare shoulder as she sat down. His touch sent a delicious shiver down her spine. "You look breathtaking," Gary whispered, his gaze drinking her in. Anna's cheeks flushed, her heart hammering violently in her chest as Gary sat across from her, his gaze never leaving her face. The waiter appeared, pouring them each a glass of sparkling champagne before disappearing silently. Gary lifted his glass, his dark eyes shimmering beneath the candlelight. "To you," he said softly, his voice deep and reverent. Anna's lips parted as she lifted her glass, her hand trembling slightly as their glasses touched with a soft, melodic chime. She took a small sip, the coolness of the drink doing nothing to soothe the warmth spreading through her chest as Gary's gaze darkened. His hand reached across the table, his fingers sliding over hers as he laced their hands together. "Anna," he began, his voice low and rough with emotion. Her breath hitched as Gary rose from his chair, his hand still wrapped around hers as he slowly dropped to one knee before her. Anna's heart slammed violently against her ribcage, her eyes widening as Gary reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Her breath caught painfully in her throat as Gary flipped the box open, revealing a stunning diamond ring that sparkled beneath the soft glow of the fairy lights. The round-cut diamond was nestled between delicate bands of platinum, the intricate design breathtakingly elegant and timeless. Tears welled up in Anna's eyes as Gary's gaze softened, his dark eyes shimmering with quiet vulnerability. "Anna," he whispered, his thumb brushing over the back of her hand. "From the moment you walked into my life, everything changed. You've given Lily a love I didn't think was possible. You've healed her heart, and you've healed mine." Anna's lips parted, her breath trembling as Gary's hand tightened around hers. "I was a broken man when I met you," he whispered, his gaze dark with quiet intensity. "I didn't know how to love. I didn't know how to give my heart to someone without fear of losing it. But you taught me how to love again. You taught me how to live again." Anna's breath broke as Gary's hand slid over her thigh, his gaze burning into hers. "You're the reason I smile now. You're the reason I wake up every morning with hope in my heart. And you're the reason Lily finally knows what it feels like to have a mother's love." Anna's breath shuddered as a single tear slipped down her cheek. Gary's thumb brushed it away, his touch reverent as he cupped her face. I don't want to spend another day without you, Anna. I don't want to fall asleep at night without you beside me. I don't want to wake up without seeing your face first thing in the morning. I want you by my side, for every moment, for every season, for the rest of my life. Anna's chest tightened painfully as Gary's gaze darkened with raw emotion. Anna, he whispered, his breath trembling. Marry me. Anna's lips parted as tears slid down her cheeks, her vision blurring as Gary's thumb brushed tenderly over her lower lip. Say yes, he whispered, his voice raw with desperation. Say you'll be mine, forever. Anna's heart hammered painfully against her chest as Gary's hand slid down her cheek, his thumb brushing over her trembling lips as his mouth hovered inches from hers. Her breath shuddered as her eyes filled with tears. Yes, she whispered, her voice breaking beneath the weight of her emotion. Gary's breath broke as his hand tightened over hers, his gaze darkening with fierce tenderness. Yes, he whispered, his breath ghosting over her lips. Anna's tears spilled over as she nodded, her breath trembling. Yes, Gary, I'll marry you. Gary's breath shattered as he slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand trembling slightly as the diamond settled against her skin. His gaze darkened as his hand slid into her hair, his mouth capturing hers in a fierce, breathless kiss that stole the air from her lungs. Anna's arms curled around his neck as Gary's mouth moved desperately over hers, his hand sliding down her back as he pulled her against him. Her breath broke as Gary's lips trailed down the side of her neck, his hand tightening over her waist as his breath hitched. Mine, he whispered against her skin. Forever. Anna's breath trembled as Gary's lips brushed over her ear, his hand sliding down her back as her fingers curled into his hair. I love you, Gary whispered, his voice rough and unsteady. I love you so much, Anna. Anna's breath shattered as her fingers tightened around his jacket. I love you too, she whispered, her voice breaking beneath the weight of her emotion. Gary's chest rose and fell as his forehead pressed against hers, his breath trembling as his lips brushed over hers once more. You're mine now, he whispered. Forever. Anna's heart swelled painfully as Gary's hand slid into her hair, his mouth lingering over hers in a slow, reverent kiss. And as Gary's arms wrapped around her, his heart hammering violently beneath her cheek, Anna knew, deep in her soul, that her life had just changed forever. Anna had become the heart of the Kristen household, her presence weaving warmth and love into every corner of their lives. The mansion that once stood as a cold, empty shell now thrummed with life and joy, every hallway and room echoing with the sound of laughter and soft whispers of affection. Mornings were filled with the sweet scent of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of Lily's giggles as Anna chased her around the sunlit kitchen. Gary would lean against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his lips as he watched Anna lift Lily into her arms, her braids falling over her shoulder as she pressed a playful kiss to Lily's cheek. Lily's tiny hands would curl around Anna's neck as she squealed with delight, and Gary's heart would tighten with quiet awe at the sight of them together. His wife and his daughter bonded so deeply that it felt as though Anna had always been part of their lives. Anna's warmth had seeped into the very walls of the house, transforming it into a sanctuary where Gary could finally breathe freely. Evenings were no longer lonely or weighed down by silence. Instead, they were filled with the soft crackle of the fireplace, the sound of Lily's soft voice as Anna tucked her into bed, reading her favorite story with quiet tenderness. Gary would often stand in the doorway, his chest swelling with love as he watched Anna stroke Lily's hair, her voice gentle and soothing as Lily's eyelids grew heavy. When Anna would rise from Lily's bed and walk toward him, Gary would reach for her, pulling her against his chest and pressing a lingering kiss to her temple. She loves you so much, he would whisper against her hair. Anna would smile, her eyes shimmering with quiet happiness as she slid her arms around his waist. And I love her, she would reply softly. Nights belonged to them, Anna and Gary, entwined beneath the soft sheets of their bed. Gary would pull her close, his hand sliding over the curve of her hip as his mouth found hers in the dark. Anna's breathless whispers of love would echo through the quiet, her hands threading through his hair as Gary worshipped her body with quiet reverence. His love for her was no longer guarded or hesitant. It flowed freely and fiercely, every kiss and touch a silent promise that he would cherish her for the rest of his life. Anna had healed him in ways he hadn't realized he needed, her kindness and understanding filling the cracks left behind by years of loneliness and loss. One summer afternoon, Gary sat on the terrace, watching Anna and Lily in the garden below. Anna was sitting on the grass, wearing a simple white sundress, her bare feet tucked beneath her as she held a bubble wand in her hand. Lily danced around her, chasing the bubbles as they floated through the warm summer air, her golden curls bouncing with each step. Anna laughed, her smile radiant beneath the golden sunlight, and Gary felt a deep ache in his chest, a quiet hum of contentment and disbelief that this life was truly his. He descended the steps and walked toward them, crouching beside Anna and wrapping an arm around her waist as Lily climbed into her lap. "What are my girls doing?" he murmured, his mouth brushing over Anna's temple. "Playing," Anna smiled, her hand resting on Gary's knee as Lily giggled and leaned against her chest. "You should join us," Anna teased. Gary smiled, his eyes darkening with warmth. "Maybe later," he whispered, his lips trailing down her neck as Anna shivered beneath his touch. Lily squealed and slid off Anna's lap, chasing a stray bubble as Gary's hand slid over Anna's back. "You make me so happy," Gary murmured, his forehead resting against hers. Anna's breath trembled as her hand slid over his chest. "And you've given me everything I never knew I needed," she whispered. A year later, their love blossomed even further when Anna told Gary the news. She had waited for the perfect moment. Late one night, as they lay curled together in bed, Gary's hand resting on her stomach. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, her voice breaking with quiet emotion. Gary's breath hitched as his head lifted, his dark eyes widening as he stared at her. "Anna," he breathed, his hand tightening over her stomach. "We're having a baby." Tears filled Anna's eyes as she nodded. "Yes." Gary's breath broke as he pulled her into his arms, his mouth crashing over hers in a desperate, breathless kiss. His hand slid beneath her nightgown, resting over the small curve of her belly as a fierce protectiveness filled his chest. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "I love you so much." Anna's tears spilled over as Gary's mouth brushed down her jaw, his hand still resting over her stomach. "I'm going to love this baby as much as I love you and Lily," he promised, his voice breaking. "I'm going to protect both of you with everything I have." 9 months later, Gary stood in the hospital room, his hand trembling as he held their newborn son for the first time. Anna lay in the hospital bed, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but glowing with quiet happiness as Gary sat beside her. "He's perfect," Gary whispered, his thumb brushing over the baby's soft cheek as the infant slept soundly in his arms. Anna's eyes shimmered with tears as Gary leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "Thank you," he whispered, "for giving me this life, for giving me a family." Anna's hand curled over his wrist as tears slipped down her cheeks. "I love you," she whispered. Gary smiled, his heart swelling painfully as he leaned down and kissed her lips. "Forever," he whispered. They brought their son home 2 days later, and Lily was the first to run to the door. "My baby brother," she squealed, her eyes wide with wonder as Gary knelt down and let her see the sleeping infant. "Be gentle," Anna whispered, her hand brushing over Lily's curls. Lily reached out and touched the baby's tiny hand, her smile widening. "He's so small," she whispered. Gary's hand slid over Anna's waist as they watched Lily sit beside the baby's crib, her hand resting gently over his chest. "You've given me everything," Gary whispered, his mouth brushing over Anna's ear. "A family, a love I never thought I'd have." Anna's hand slid over his chest as she leaned into him. "And you've given me a home," she whispered. Gary's breath broke as his arms tightened around her, his mouth pressing over her hair. Their life was no longer defined by loneliness or fear. It was built on love, trust, and quiet devotion. And as Gary stood with Anna wrapped in his arms, their newborn son sleeping peacefully in his crib, and Lily curled up beside them, he knew, without any doubt, that he had finally found peace.